Welcome to a special episode of the Hollywood Reporters Behind the Screen. I'm Carolyn Giardina, and today's guest, who I'm very happy to introduce, is my colleague, Scott Feinberg. I'm sure you've all been following his excellent awards coverage all season. Scott is the Hollywood Reporter's longtime awards columnist and the host of THR's Awards Chatter podcast. Scott, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for having me. It's great to talk to you, and great job with your podcast.
So as we know, the Oscar nominations are now out, and this has been a year, it goes without saying, this has been a year like no other. What are your overall impressions following the announcements?
Well, I think the first thing, and you can speak to this as well, is, there's this assumption on the part of people in my life, at least, that this is, it must be a slower season. The movie theaters have been closed, and, it's just, not as many events and not having to travel to festivals. But I can tell you, in my experience, because of the magic of Zoom and other stuff like it, I feel like everybody thinks they can schedule everything, and there's an expectation that you are going to be able to attend and cover everything. And so I actually have found it to be busier than your average season, but not complaining, happy to be employed and healthy and here. And so, yeah, I think that was the climate going into the nominations. Then the nominations came out, and I really feel like there's two ways of looking at it. On the one hand, if I'm ABC and the Academy, I'm probably a little nervous that the most nominated movie by far is a black and white period piece, that you only have one movie from a traditional major studio that's nominated for Best Picture, and that the cumulative box office of all the Best Picture nominees, all 8, is only something like $15 million. That's disconcerting when, historically viewership has been tied to the popularity of the Best Picture nominees. On the other hand, for that part of this, you could say the movies have never been more accessible because they're all streaming or were streaming. I think Judas and the Black Messiah has now been pulled back off streaming so that it can be seen in theaters as those start to reopen. But so that's the kind of TV side of things. In terms of just the quality of the nominees, though, I think it's actually a very good year. A lot of diversity, a lot of spreading the wealth just between a lot of good movies. And I'm sure that's stuff that you're going to want to talk about, so I won't preempt it.
Okay. Well, you know what? I want to start with a question about about animated features to start with. To date, only 3 animated movies have been nominated for Best Picture: Disney's 1991 classic Beauty and the Beast, and more recently, Pixar's Up and Toy Story 3. There had been some speculation, at least among some members of the crafts community, that there might have been a 4th this year, especially in this unusual year. With so much blurring the lines between live action and animation, when do you think we'll see more animation in the top category, or why does it remain so rare?
It's a great question. I think it probably, the likelihood of when it will start happening, I basically think it could start happening as soon as next year. If there's a movie like A Soul, for instance, this year, which is probably the one that you're referring to as, it seemed like it was a plausible Best Picture nominee. The reason I say next year versus this year is that, for whatever reason, as of this year, they're still having Best Picture nominees fluctuate anywhere between 5 and 10, depending on a whole mathematical formula that virtually nobody in the real world or even in the Academy understands. To me, it's always been a little bizarre, because for a group that doesn't want to be criticized for lacking diversity, or, that wants to give people more reasons to tune into the show based on having popular nominees, there's no downside to having a fixed 10, which is what they had in their early years. It's what they had for a few years after The Dark Knight was not included in the top 5. And it's what we are going back to, a fixed 10 next year. And so, this year we ended up with 8 Best Picture nominees. And if you're the people involved with Soul or News of the World or One Night in Miami or Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, you have to be saying, like, who does it benefit to have 8 versus 10? It doesn't make a lot of sense. And so we could have had an animated nominee this year, quite possibly, if there had been 10. And I think the odds will definitely increase going forward.
Okay, well, let's talk about the animated feature race. No real surprises. The nominees are Onward, Over the Moon, Shaun the Sheep movie, Farmageddon, Soul, and Wolf Walkers. I know these are the same ones that you projected. What are your thoughts on this category this year?
It's interesting because you have, first of all, let's note 2 from Pixar with Onward and Soul.
Onward and
you have
Soul.
2 from Netflix as well, Over the Moon and Shaun the Sheep movie, Farmageddon. And then you have Apple TV with its first ever nomination in this category with Wolf Walkers. And so just the fact that it's a relatively limited pool of distributors is kind of interesting. Obviously, we talk about every year the fact that Pixar, now particularly as part of the Disney family, has a large built-in block of voters who just by doing so well each year then get invited to join the organization, and it kind of sometimes becomes a self-perpetuating thing. And so I would think that they are at an advantage. Plus, Soul is an excellent movie that's been well received and all of that. So yeah, I think Soul's the one to beat. I believe you agree with that, but it's a pretty solid year. I mean, none of these are out of the blue choices. They're all movies that have been accessible to the public and that people sort of enjoy. And that's not to knock we've had a bunch of years where you'll have a G-Kids movie that most people in America haven't caught up with yet or something. And those are often great, but just leave a lot of voters kind of catching up, and sometimes they don't catch up before they vote. This year, I think particularly if you have a young person in the family, these are all movies that were already on your radar.
Right. And then just to go over all of them, I mean, yes, Soul is certainly the presumed front runner, but I think these are all movies that were well received. Wolf Walkers for director Tom Moore, he's 3 for 3. His previous 2 movies in his trilogy, Secret of Kells and Song of the Sea, were both nominated. The Shaun the Sheep, Aardman's track record is very strong. Onward obviously is Pixar, and Netflix. This is their second year having an original animated movie that they made, and again they're nominated.
Yeah, it's a big kind of inroads in a short amount of time for them, and I think that original animation and family programming is generally very important to them. So this is something they're very happy about, and I think that we shouldn't overlook the amazingness of what Pete Docter has achieved here as now the most nominated person in the history of this category. The category's not been around forever, or else Walt Disney would have that honor. But he is sort of our modern, maybe closest thing. Certainly one of them, and so it's a big thing for him to be here. I think as a 4-time now nominee, along with Dana Murray. And I guess one thing that is interesting, caught my eye, is that the Golden Globes, as you and I were covering, declared that co-director Kemp Powers was a nominee and therefore a winner at the Golden Globes, but the Oscars apparently did not recognize him as a nominee, and so he'll have to settle for being a nominee for just adapted screenplay for One Night in Miami.
One Night in Miami. And then just to go over Pete's record, as you said, this is his 4th nomination in the category, which is a record. And if you add his nominations for screenplay and animated short, this is actually his 9th Oscar nomination.
It's amazing. Yeah, I mean, really, I guess with Lasseter now out of the game, he's the elder statesman in a way of animation, isn't he?
He's certainly one of them. Although if we're talking about elder statesmen, we should also mention that Over the Moon is directed by Glenn Keane, who is a Disney legend who is, credited for characters such as the Beast in 1991's Beauty and the Beast, and has a pretty astonishing record.
Totally. And it's nice to see Glenn Keane back there. For a long time, we would talk about Glenn Keane as one of the great people in animation who had never been nominated. Then he got nominated with the late, great Kobe Bryant for Dear Basketball, the animated short, 3 years ago. They won, and it's just sad, obviously, that Kobe doesn't get another shot at showing what he can do again. But it's great that Glenn Keane is back so soon.
Right. Well, it's an interesting category. Let's move to cinematography. One thing we know for certain with this category is we're going to have a first-time winner this year.
That's right. That's right.
Four of the five are first-time Oscar nominees. Sean Bobbitt for Judas and the Black Messiah, Eric Messerschmidt for Mank, Darius Wolski for News of the World, and Joshua James Richards for Nomadland. And then our fifth nominee is Phaedon Papamichael for Trial of Chicago 7, and that's his second nomination.
Yeah, it's a really kind of interesting group of movies that are each, to my eye, very different from each other in their styles and their cinematographer styles. I mean, you've got everything from the black and white kind of grainy look that they've used with Mank to Nomadland is a more, I guess, like muted color, but with an amazing tracking shot that, you know, people like me who aren't real students of cinematography like you and probably a lot of your listeners, I mean, that's the kind of thing that really impresses us, just to see that, you know, where Frances McDormand's walking through the camps is just sort of very artfully done. But, you know, I don't think of a particular shot or style with Judas or News of the World or Trial, but I know that those movies certainly have their fans. So I think it's a tough category to call.
One thing we probably should point out on the black and white front is, you know, just for some history, the cinematography Oscar was first handed out in 1928, and then in 1939 it became two separate categories, one for color and one for black and white, and then it was merged into a single category, in 1968. Since then, only two black and white movies have won this category: Schindler's List in 1994 and Roma in 2009. With Mank, we could see a third this year.
Yeah, and it's strange to me, sort of, but I guess not when you really break it down, that there haven't been more beautifully done black and white winners with the Academy, whereas I think they tend to be recognized with things like the ASC, the Guild, and then also the Camera Image, I think. And they tend, cinematographers seem to really love black and white. And I think maybe the problem is that when it's been used in movies that then go to the Oscars, those movies are not always more widely appealing. And we know that the winners are chosen by the full Academy, of which cinematographers are probably like 3 to 5%. I haven't checked the latest numbers, but so you basically have 95% of people whose expertise is not in cinematography overruling the people who say, you know, something like The Artist or The White Ribbon or, you know, others
Cold
like that.
War was another recent one.
Yeah.
In the ASC.
Yeah, that was, and yeah, won Camera Image, right? And then didn't win at the Oscars. And I just think part of that is that it's a limited audience for a non-English language movie, and when you then go to the full Academy to pick that award. But I mean, Mank clearly is not going to suffer from that problem because it's the most nominated movie of the year again. So I think that there's a real shot there, although and I'd like to check the numbers on this myself. I think it is quite often a coattail category, and the likeliest Best Picture winner clearly at this point is Nomadland. So it would seem like, you know, fans of that movie could just go down the line, and this would certainly be one of the categories that if you love Nomadland, you probably love the way it was shot.
Okay. Well, let's move on to film editing. The nominees are The Father, Nomadland, Promising Young Woman, Sound of Metal, and The Trial of Chicago 7. And we should talk about Chloe Zhao's nomination for Nomadland. Editing is one of her 4 nominations, including directing, writing, and Best Picture. And the last time we saw the winner of the film editing category go to the person who directed the movie is Gravity, when Alfonso Cuarón shared that award with Mark Sanger. What are your thoughts on Chloe in this category?
I think it's a real shot. I think that we also have to keep a close eye on Sound of Metal, which sort of reminds me of Whiplash, which did well about, 6-7 years ago. And just the sort of, now that one was truly about just showy. Not only about, but there was some showy cutting there with the drum playing and the intensity of that one. This one obviously tonally is a different movie, but also about a drummer, heavy metal drummer, who's on the one hand kind of goes between his life as a guy living in the fast lane and then a guy who's losing his hearing as a result. I think that one has a very real shot as well. I think a sleeper could be The Father, because what we're looking at there, it's, so much of that movie is about deliberately disorienting the viewer, I think, but in a way that ultimately kind of still makes, comes to make sense. And I think that that should not be discounted either. I'd be harder pressed to see Promising Young Woman or Trial of Chicago 7 winning, but maybe you disagree. I don't know.
Well, one thing we know for certain, like cinematography, we're going to have a first-time winner in this category. Like cinematography, 4 of the 5 are first-time nominees. The veteran in this category is actually Alan Baumgarten, who edited Trial of the Chicago 7. He was previously nominated for American Hustle.
Wow, yeah. And it's very competently done, and they obviously, I think... have to in that one, I would imagine one of the challenges was just juggling so many different storylines, which partly give credit to the script, but partly that's certainly the editor. And I mean, I guess if that movie ends up picking up late momentum, it could carry over there, but it just feels like right now the coattail vote and would be Nomadland, and then I would think that if they get adventurous, it would probably be Sound of Metal.
Interesting. Okay. Well, we're going to move to makeup and hairstyling. And this was very notable this year because Ma Rainey's nomination made Mia Neal and Jamaica Wilson the first Black Oscar nominees in the makeup and hairstyling category.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy that hadn't happened before, and it's great. And to be honest, they're probably the favorites to win, because that movie is so much about the transformation, particularly of Viola Davis's character. I mean, I talked to a guy who knows Viola Davis, who visited that set to conduct some interviews and walked right by Viola Davis, didn't even realize it was her. And so that does feel like the kind of, single character, just total transformation that the Academy has rewarded in recent years with, whether it's Darkest Hour or I believe The Iron Lady. And so I think that they're likeliest. I mean, I don't know that there's a huge percentage of the Academy that's even seen Emma or Pinocchio. I know there is a large percentage of the Academy that does not like Hillbilly Elegy, which is going to hurt them even if the makeup and hairstyling work is worthy. And then you've got Mank, which I think, it's tough because Gary Oldman's literally made the point of saying in every interview that David Fincher told him, you're going to be basically naked in this part, where in the sense that no hair, no makeup, this is going to be you. And so I don't think that talking point doesn't necessarily help their makeup and hairstyling nominees.
Well, I would say in this category, and I agree with you, Ma Rainey's does feel like the presumed front runner right now. But I think with that and editing and a lot of the others, there's still a long way to go, and a lot can happen in the next month and a half.
True.
Music category. What's notable here is that Trent Reznor and Atticus Ross have 2 nominations for Mank and for Soul, which they share with John Batiste. The other nominees are Da 5 Bloods, Minari, and News of the World. What's your overall impression of this group?
I mean, so far, Reznor and Ross have been recognized for these two films at basically everywhere, Critics' Choice, Golden Globes, and in each case, I think it's been breaking towards Soul. So I have to assume that is the case, the most likely scenario here as well. Although, animated movie scores have been recognized. You certainly know, and I think that it would be certainly nice to see Terrence Blanchard or James Newton Howard finally recognized in this category, but and Emile Mosseri for Minari, that's a lovely kind of understated thing. But I think it's between the Reznor Ross scores, and I would guess it breaks for Soul.
Let's move on to production design. Really varied group between period and then something like Tenant. But we have The Father, Ma Rainey's Black Bottom, Mank, News of the World, Tenant. And I think most of these you had projected as well.
Yeah, and I have to say the feedback that I've gotten to these nominations in this category, it's been interesting. Like the one that people are kind of a little perplexed by is The Father, because they're sort of saying like, what did you made a nice living room. And that's probably unfair to these guys. I'm sure there's a lot more to it, but it is the least showy of these. I would think that Tenet is the most. It's just a huge scale movie that obviously was not overall immensely popular with the Academy based on the fact that it's not nominated in too many major categories. But I think that this is somewhere where it could do well, as I believe other Nolan films have done in the past. Mank is very innovative in its own way, and I think these are, veteran production designer Donald Graham Burt and set director Jan Pascal, and I think that they should not be counted out. And News of the World is impressive. They've created multiple towns in one, that were meant to be parts of Texas, and they did it in Santa Fe on a ranch. It's a great story, but again, if your movie itself is not particularly popular, it's hard to overcome that when you're now going to voting with the full Academy. So my guess is that it's probably Tenet.
Well, let's move to a category that, without question, it had a lot of attention this season, even before recent events, which was sound. So the Academy voted to combine the sound editing and sound mixing categories into a single category for Best Sound. This is something that we had been talking about for a number of years, really. And it's now one category. The nominees this year: Greyhound, Mank, News of the World, Soul, and Sound of Metal. And just looking at how these worked out, both the Motion Picture Sound Editors and the Cinema Audio Society, which is the sound mixers, all gave at least one nomination to each of these 5 movies, and the BAFTA's nominated 4 of 5 of them. So what is your impression of just really this new category?
Well, I mean, if I were a person from the sound community, I would have certainly been not thrilled that you're going to lose one more shot at possibly getting an Oscar, but I do think that it's kind of hard to justify having multiple for sound when there was a time when they had black and white cinematography and color cinematography. There was a time when, there were other categories that have since been consolidated. So I think it's probably overall the fairest way to go, and also helps with a telecast that's increasingly challenging to draw viewers to. So from that point of view, I would say overall it's a positive thing that they've consolidated. I think that in terms of the winner, again, considering that the vast majority of people who vote in this category are not specialists in sound, when you have a nominee that has the word sound in its title, that probably is going to give it an advantage. So Sound of Metal, that's a good move on your part if you were playing for that Oscar. But Soul also, I think that, it's impressive work, and with people who are part of that who, Ren Kleiss, these are, again, names that we've seen in this category in years past.
And let's give Ren a shout out for a double nomination too, because he's nominated for both Mank and Soul.
Exactly. And I would say that if Sound of Metal doesn't win, it would be one of the Ren Kleiss options, probably. I don't really think Greyhound or News of the World are huge threats to win here, but we'll see.
Well, let's talk about visual effects. This is the first time in more than a decade that we don't have a Best Picture contender in the category and or a Marvel movie in the race.
That's really interesting, yeah.
Instead, we have Love and Monsters, The Midnight Sky, Mulan, The One and Only Ivan, and Tenet. What is your impression of this category this year?
Well, I can tell you right off the bat that I cannot imagine a scenario, and maybe I'll have to eat my words on April 26th, but I cannot imagine a scenario in which Love and Monsters, Mulan, or the one and only Ivan even have a prayer of winning, just because the vast majority of the Academy has not seen these movies and will not see these movies. These are not in any way kind of across the board contenders or movies that appeal primarily to Academy demographic voters. I know we all have this hope that they take this as seriously as, the biggest Oscar geeks among us, but the reality is many of them are busy in their careers or just not interested in watching movies that they see as targeted at kids, as some of these they might regard. And so, again, you can only really vote from a pool of what you've seen, which to me leaves this between The Midnight Sky and Tenet. And if there's one thing that Tenet's known for and applauded for, I do think it's visual effects. And so I wouldn't totally count out Midnight Sky, which does some pretty innovative things with like floating blood in particular, as you know, and just different stuff there. But that's not a movie that was especially well received, and B, it's stuff we've sort of seen before with, and maybe I would say better probably with Gravity or some of these other space set kinds of movies. And so I think this is another spot for Tenet to pick up a win.
Well, I agree with you that Tenet and The Midnight Sky certainly appear to be the two front runners, and they're very different movies. Tenet, Christopher Nolan likes to do as much in camera, with practical effects as possible, and in this case, they even towed a plane into a set in one sequence.
Wow. Wow.
And then, and Midnight Sky, we saw some new virtual production techniques used. We saw face replacement. And some of those space set scenes were, completely CG. So I think, we saw a variety of techniques in there. But across this category, it will be interesting to watch.
Yeah. And I just want to, I believe with the face replacement situation on Midnight Sky, that was because Felicity was pregnant, right? Felicity Jones. And so they had to kind of cover that to a degree. And so, between that and the floating blood droplets and stuff, they have some good talking points, and they do also have Netflix behind them, and Netflix is looking to run up its count of wins as much as possible, and they have resources and a lot of people working to do that. So, I would not rule out Midnight Sky here, but my gut is Tenet.
Okay. Well, we'll see what happens in the coming week. So as we look back on the nominations, let me ask you one other question, Scott. Is there a particular film or films that you would like to have seen get more attention than they did this season?
Sure. There's always a bunch. I, for instance, particularly love documentaries, and I thought The Truffle Hunters, The Dissident, I could go on with many others. I thought
there were some great documentaries.
Yeah, it's just a shame that they can only have 5. Maybe that's a category that ought to be 10 when you look at just how many good documentaries are being made now. But that was one area. I also, I think apparently more than most people liked Malcolm and Marie. And, I think there's some indie movies that even in a year without many studio movies still got lost this year. The Assistant is a really maybe more powerful to those of us who work in this industry and recognize some particularly uncomfortable things there. But that was a very well acted by Julia Garner movie that's sort of basically about Harvey Weinstein's reign of terror. There's plenty I would have liked to have seen more. I feel bad for Delroy Lindo from The Five Bloods, who was great and just boxed out of a tough category. I feel sorry for Sophia Loren. Not that, she'll be fine. She has an Oscar already, but I thought, at her age to be, I think 86, to be doing great work in The Life Ahead, would have liked to have seen her get in there for another nomination. The list goes on. It's hard, I'm sure, for somebody like Jodie Foster, who won a Golden Globe, to not even be nominated for an Oscar for the same performance. But again, that's it's not a first time thing that's ever happened. So just happy that we got a bunch of them in there that I do really love, like Nomadland, which was not really a question, but plenty of good stuff to celebrate.
I'll add one more to the list. Is I would personally like to have seen Welcome to Chechnya get a little more attention than it did. I thought that its use of digital face replacement to tell the story without, blurring the face, which is what we typically see in a documentary, was incredibly involving and really a fascinating approach to nonfiction filmmaking. And I suspect we're going to see a lot more of that going forward in documentary work.
I think it was very well done, a little bit. And by the way, not something that was done just for the sake of showing that they could do something. This was, for people who don't know, done to protect the identities of people whose lives would have been at risk if they had their real faces shown. But you don't want to necessarily kind of put them behind a silhouette like we've seen on, some of these crime shows on TV, Unsolved Mysteries or something. And so it was an innovative thing. I think I'm a little worried that maybe the VFX branch, when they were winnowing down their field to these nominees, ultimately felt that it was either, sort of in a sense, a gimmick that they don't want to necessarily encourage over more extensive VFX work, or that, they know perhaps that in broader society, the idea of this kind of technology is actually very disconcerting because, you can make it appear that anyone is saying or doing anything. And that is something that makes a lot of people uncomfortable. But for the purposes of this documentary, you're absolutely right. It was great and would have been nice to see it there, recognized in that category or in the documentary feature category.
Right. So yesterday you also did some reporting about the what the Oscar ceremony is going to look like this year.
Yeah, I still think it's all subject to change, like everything these days, because we'll see if there's another surge or anything with the pandemic. We'll see just a lot of things. But right now, the plan of the Academy is to do part of the ceremony at the Dolby Theater, like usual, but part of it at Union Station downtown, which is a new idea. And, they used to do the Oscars actually downtown in the early days. And so there was a famous incident with Claudette Colbert basically thinking she had no chance of winning for It Happened One Night in 1935 at that ceremony, and headed to Union Station, I believe, to catch a train. And they literally held the train and pulled her off to come get the Oscar at the Biltmore, I think it was, and then they put her back on the train. So, it's not the first time Union Station's factored into it. We're not totally clear how Union Station actually will factor into it this year, because I believe that they wanted to basically have an option to make this as socially distanced as they feel they need to be on the date of the Oscars. But I'm guessing that may be more for the kind of big set piece type stuff, like a performance of the original song contenders or something like that. But there will be nobody in the audience at either location who is not a nominee, a presenter, or a guest of a nominee. And so I don't know who these people would be performing in front of at Union Station, aside from, either cutout people, which has literally been used at like the Super Bowl, or I just don't know. But it's gonna be unlike anything we've ever seen before, and it can't be worse than some of the other award shows that have preceded it, which really were disasters. So leave it to Steven Soderbergh, among others, who's one of this year's producers of the show, to get creative.
All right. Well, the Oscars are on April 25th, and I'm sure we'll learn a lot more about the show in the next coming weeks. And certainly there's a lot more to talk about, and I'm sure a lot will change in the individual races during that time. But it was great to get your views at this stage. Scott, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and talk to you before it's all over.
Okay. Stay safe.